Hey, everybody. Okay, so tonight I want to talk about FI in sort of a new way. I'm thinking of describing it. I mean, I don't think it really changes anything, but I think it's a good way to sort of think about it. Um, and I'm going to start off with an example, which is anybody who's been to law school, you'll recognize this probably. It's a very famous series of cases that sort of establish how the US thinks about property law and tort law and everything. And I will acknowledge it's very US centric. Other cultures, other countries might have, or legal systems might solve this issue totally different ways. So here's a scenario. So back in the 1800s, when the trains were first being made and the train tracks across the US, um, they kept running into this problem where the trains would go by farmland and sparks would be flying out of the train because they're coal powered and there's fire, and so there's like sparks and embers and stuff coming out of the train as it's going along. And these sparks, every once in a while, would land on a farmer's property and sometimes land on like bundles of hay, right? And set the hay on fire or other sort of, I think flax was like the common example. And I guess that's used to make hay or some sort of straw or something. But just think of some dry bundle of hay or whatever, and sparks fly on it and it catches fire, and of course wreaks all kinds of havoc on this poor farmer's land, right? Um so there was a big thing about, well, what do we do about that, right? And um and some of you, especially the heavy FI users, might think that the answer is pretty obvious. Or maybe even, the non-heavy FI users might think that there's sort of like this TI way of approaching it and it should be obvious, right? So back in the 1800s, when, the train tracks were, being developed and laid out, you have to keep in mind that, in the US, it was very property rights were like sacred, and so there was this sort of general rule that you were allowed to do whatever the hell you wanted to do on your property, right? um with very limited exceptions, and especially out in the West when where these trains were being developed, or train tracks were being laid. And so it sort of creates this problem, right? Because the farmers are trying to stop the trains from setting their hay on fire. So all they can really do is sue them and say, hey, stop letting these sparks out of your train, because you're setting our stuff on fire. And the train companies, the railroad companies, were like, well, it's our property, we could do what we want with it, right? And if you limit the trains, or if you fight against the trains, you're fighting against technology and progress, right? And you're just getting in the way. um and so what you need to do is just move your hay further away from the train tracks so it doesn't become a problem. um this is a pretty easy solution. But the farmers are like, well, it's our property. We could do whatever we want with our property, right? You shouldn't be able to tell me what I'm supposed to do with my property or on my property, right? So you have this general rule that people can pretty much do whatever they want on their property, and nobody could tell them otherwise, right? And so how do you solve this problem? And and so for those of you who want to look it up, it's called the Sparks cases or something. There's a whole series of cases, right? And there's different ways that you could think about it, right? There's really no easy TI solution here. Because if you just use the standard default rule that you can do whatever you want on your property, then you know if it's your property, then you can do what you want. It's my property, so therefore I can do what I want. A very TI condition or logic. You don't solve the problem, right? Because you have the competing interests. So then you could add on a condition and you could say, okay, well, you can do what you want with your property as long as you're not hurting others. Okay. And so then you're like, okay, well, obviously the farmers aren't really hurting others. Well, let's put a pin in that, at least not directly. But and clearly the the railroad companies are, quote unquote, hurting others by, setting their hay on fire with these sparks flying out. But, the railroad companies would come back and say, well, you have some level, if you're a property owner, you have some level of responsibility of taking care of your own property, right? And you can't just put yourself out there and allow people to hurt you, right? In that sense. So in other words, like, we're going to do what we want on our property. We're going to try not to hurt others, but you kind of have to meet us both halfway here, because you do have some responsibility to take care of your stuff, right? And, so why don't you build a fence, or build some sort of protection over your hay, or just move your hay, to some other place that's away from the train tracks, right? And I know farmers would come back and they would say, well, maybe I can't move my hay that far, right? Maybe I don't really have that much land. I don't know if that's the case or not. Or why would I have to spend the money, to build a shed or some sort of protection over my stuff? Why don't you just stop setting my stuff on fire, right? And so it becomes a whole question of, are you responsible for taking care of, what's on your land, or is the other person responsible for, sort of the harm they're putting out in the world? And so the series of Sparks cases sort of led to, you know, sort of a definitive way that we think about these sorts of issues, at least in the US. And it had to do with this concept called externalities. And it's sort of based off of economics. And the idea is, if you put harm out into the world, you're causing what they call a negative externality. Um, and if you do that, then at least in the US system, you're most likely going to be found to be the person in the wrong, right? In other words, if you're the train company and you're putting danger out into the world, you're sending the sparks out into the world, then you're on the hook, right? You're the one sort of creating the problem, and you shouldn't expect everybody else to sort of, have to react and, move their hay or build a fence or a shed or something to protect it. Okay. So, what does this have to do with FI, right? Well, the thing is that especially in the law, the lawyers and law professors and judges, they like to think of the law as this very logical system, um, and everything is based off of logic, and being very analytical and applying the rules in a very analytical way to come out with some sort of objective solution to the problem, right? That if you're just smart enough and rational enough and and diligent enough, you're going to you're going to come up with the quote unquote logical answer to the problem. But you can imagine, going back to this train situation, there could be other legal systems or other sort of governmental systems, whatever rules, they come up with a very different solution to the problem. They could say, look, it's going to cost the train companies way too much money to have to, pay for the damage here. Every time a spark, creates a problem. And again, if the train company, if you make things too expensive for the train companies, you're impeding progress and you're impeding, technological and economic development. And obviously the trains were very important to, the US economy. So it was almost like, fighting against the internet, right? Like the internet's causing too many problems, and making Microsoft or Google or Apple, pay for their externalities. Um, and probably even more so back then, fighting against the train companies. And so it was a really big deal, for the courts to come out and say, okay, the trains companies are going to be, or railroad companies are going to be on the hook here. So they would have to come up with inventions to sort of, protect, keep the embers or the sparks from flying, some sort of shield that they had to put on. And of course, that was a big cost to them, and they had to, probably update all their trains. And even if it wasn't 100%, protective, if, somebody's hay caught on fire or whatever, then, they were going to have to pay for it, right? Now, of course, they would have to, they get insurance and all that stuff to pay for it. But again, they could have just as easily turned the argument around and said, well, the farmers should just buy insurance or move their hay, or or whatever. You should put the responsibility on them. Okay, so FI, you know, that is where FI comes in. I mean, because ultimately there's no real TI solution. There's no like absolutely objective solution to this problem, right? Because you could imagine lots of different solutions, or at least a few different solutions, depending on what sort of legal system you sort of adhere to, right? And you can't even just say, property law will figure it out, right? Or or just, allow the farmers and the railroad companies to enter into contracts and let them figure it out amongst themselves, right? That was also another sort of approach, right? Um, that, the two parties should just figure it out rather than suing each other. Well, that doesn't work, at least in this case. So there's all sorts of solutions you could imagine, but at the essence, like there has to be a ground rule set, right? And at least in the US, they decided that the fairest solution, or the fairest rule, was to this externality rule, that if you put harm out into the world and you're causing damage on somebody else's property, that's your fault, not their fault, for being quote unquote irresponsible and not protecting their stuff, or not buying insurance or whatever, right? So there's these default rules that have to be established, because TI is not going to solve all of our legal and social problems that we have with each other, because eventually you're going to have some sort of situation where the rules sort of butt up against each other. Like, for example, if the TI rule was you could do whatever you want on your property, then eventually obviously that's going to start butting up against each other. So FI ends up being a lot more important, I think, than people give it credit for, right? We tend to think of, and I do this as well, when we talk about FI, it tends to be described like there's some sort of emotion involved, or some sort of positive versus negative value. I like this versus I don't like it. And I think there's a lot to that, right? And I think that's sort of the basic structure, or the basic principle that everything is built off of. But when you think of FI as being a deliberation function, right? It's trying to make a decision about something. And I think it's more complicated than just, do I like something or do I not like something? I think that's part of it. And I think that's sort of the fundamental element of it. But when you're thinking of sort of, especially lead FI personality types, or, secondary auxiliary FI types, they're doing something that's way more complicated than I like this versus I don't like this, right? Or this is cool or this is not cool. It's a much more sophisticated process than that. And it is solving those ethical problems or legal problems, or whatever, however you want to think about it, by basically coming up with sort of a rule that is fair, right? And what do we mean by fair? Well, that is kind of in the eye of the beholder, or kind of based off of your culture, your experience, your personal experience, your culture's experience, what your culture expects, right? Again, in the US, we're very, very, we think of property and our own properties rights as being, these sacred, like rights given to you from God, right? Especially back in the 1800s. But other cultures where there aren't these individual property rights, they might have a very, very different solution to what they think is fair in that situation, right? You could have sort of a might makes right type of society. Well, the trains are more important than this little farmer's land, and we'll just make the farmers deal with it, and they can move their hay or build some sort of protection, but we're not going to mess with big railroad company because they're just too big to fail or too important, right, to mess with and make them responsible. You can imagine, there's probably governments out there that are like that. And we're not going to let these little farmers, get in our way of economic progress. Okay. And so FI, again, it becomes this fairness generator. I like to think of it as, where it's deliberating and sort of trying to come up with a solution to a problem where TI just doesn't do it, right? Or relying on TI too much creates these sort of absurd results. So let me give you some more examples here. So imagine you're working for some company and your employer or your boss gives you a bonus. At the beginning of the year, he comes to you and says, hey, if you do X, Y, and Z by the end of the year, we'll give you a couple $1,000s in a bonus. But you have to stay with us the entire year, right? So that means you have to work until December 31st. And otherwise, if you're not working for us on December 31st, we don't owe you the bonus. Okay, great. So you do all the work, you accomplish X, Y, and Z. Now it's December 30th. You're all excited, excuse me, because you've earned your bonus and you're going to get it. But it's December 30th and the boss decides he doesn't want to pay you the bonus, so he just fires you and says, haha, you don't get your bonus because our agreement was you had to work until December 31st to get the bonus. And technically, right, you didn't work till December 31st, so you don't get the bonus. Okay. And so in a completely TI world, right, where you just run the formula, right, the logical formula, the conditional formula into your TI machine, then you would come out with the result that says no bonus, right? You were supposed to work through December 31st. You did not work through December 31st. Therefore, no bonus, right? And that would be the quote unquote logical solution to that issue. And sorry, Charlie, world's not fair, right? So, you know, does the law allow that? Well, at one point it probably did, because not only did we have, the sacred property rights that were protected by law, but we also had these sacred rights to contract, right? And you could imagine a court or a judge, if presented with this situation, saying, well, you entered into that contract knowing full well that this guy could terminate you the day before. Why didn't you put something in your contract that prevented that from happening? Such as, if I'm terminated without cause or something like that, then I get paid the bonus, even if I'm not working December 31st. But if you're the employee who, was given that bonus, you're just like, that just doesn't seem fair. It doesn't seem fair that somebody should be able to just fire me the day before they're supposed to pay me, even though I didn't do anything. They just don't want to pay me. But there, were cases out there that were sort of similar, that's where they came out. So, but then you get, judges sort of exercising more of an FI approach, right? And they're just like, look, we're going to institute some rules of fairness here. We're not just going to look at everything technically and completely, just using TI logic. We're going to, provide some FI backstop. And that's where you get concepts like, exercising good faith, or if you enter into a contract, there's this implied obligation for both parties to operate in good faith, right? So even if you don't put it in your contract that, hey, we're gonna do this in good, quote unquote, good faith, meaning we're not going to screw each other over and pull the rug on somebody right at the end. We're going to, sort of act reasonably here, quote unquote, or fairly. Then even if you don't put that in the contract, that's fine, right? The courts are just going to assume that when parties are interacting with each other, and employers and employees, they're doing it in good faith. And you see this all the time in the law, because, like the quote says, the law is an ass, and you always get these absurd results if you just follow the technical rule, right? And there's this whole concept in US and sort of Britain common law, law of equity, where again, they're just trying to find a fair answer. So for example, if, let's just say I walk to the bus stop every day, and when I do that, I cut through my neighbor's yard, right? Because it's just faster that way. So I'm actually, I cut through their front yard and then through their backyard, and I get to the bus stop quicker that way. And they know that I'm doing it. Like they wave hi to me as I'm going through, and it's not any sort of problem for anybody. But then one day they just decide that, that they don't like me or whatever, and they sue me for, trespassing or something like that. Well, there's this concept of latches, right? Like, yeah, I'm technically trespassing, but you knew I was doing it for years and you didn't do anything about it. And now all of a sudden you're bringing this case, and, it's almost like you sort of entrapped me or something, right, into this case. The law is not going to allow you to, well, as long as you can make a good argument here, courts aren't going to allow you to just, sue somebody after you've been letting them do it for 10 years. Now, in the TI world, yes, technically I am trespassing. Yes, technically I'm violating some sort of statute or tort law or something, and the property owner has the right to sue me for trespassing, if they want. But in the law of equity, it's like, really? You let this guy do this for years, and now you're gonna, bring it out against them. That just doesn't seem fair, right? Um, Another example, let's say I'm a painter and you hire me to paint your kitchen. And you say, here's all the colors that I want, and blah, 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 blah. So I go out and I buy $100 worth of supplies. I get all the colors, I get all the tape, everything that you need I need to do the job. And then I show up to your house and you're like, yeah, well, I don't really need you anymore. I decided not to paint it, or I went with somebody else and they're going to do it. My brother's going to do it and he'll do it for free. So I'm out $100, because I relied on you. And then I'm like, okay. And then you say, well, we never really signed a contract and blah, 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 blah. I never really officially told you, that I'm hiring you, or there was some, ambiguity or vagueness, blah, 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 blah. But they're really just trying to get out of it. And here I am. I just spent $100. I got the color of paint that you want. And it's probably, it's going to be hard, to convince somebody else to use it, right? So, screwed out of this $100. Well, again, the courts could come in and say that's just not fair. So even though we didn't have a contract signed or whatever, or there was some vagueness or some ambiguity, I relied on your promise to pay me, or your promise that I, for this job. And I went out and spent $100, and it's not fair, right? That, I'm out this money, that, when I was relying on you and what you, promised me, which was this job. And that, they call that promissory estoppel, and you learn all about that in law school too. And so the point here is that, again, lawyers, judges, law professors, everybody who's, involved with the law and the study of the law, they like to think of it as this very TI system, this very analytical, objective system, where there are just these rules from on high. And as long as you follow the rules, you're going to come to the logical, correct outcome anytime there's a dispute. But the more disputes you get, the more you realize, the more cases you read in law school and all that, you realize that, no, you can't just rely on simple TI rules, right? You've got to, almost a majority of the time, or definitely a majority of the time, and almost all the time, you have to have this sort of FI backstop that keeps people from just relying on the technicality and making sure that people are operating fairly, right? And that's either in the business world or in the social world or in family law or the criminal justice system. We certainly want the courts and the police and the prosecutors to act fairly. And we might disagree on what it means to be fair, right? And that's where the battles are fought and won in court. And the majority of cases are not about, or at least cases that go to the Supreme Court or appellate court, things like that. They're not about what happened factually, right? Like who did it? Was it the butler or was it, somebody else? I mean, that's all figured out at the trial court level. The appeals are more about, what's fair. I interpret the rule this way. The opponent interprets the rule a different way. What's the fair outcome a lot of times? And again, they'll come up with something where it's just like, well, here's the logical solution. And they present it as in this very TI, of course, this is the logical steps you have to take to figure out the answer to this problem. But usually, it's based off of some sort of FI fairness thing. Again, think of the trains and whether or not the railroad company should be responsible or the farmers. Okay. So FI users tend to, especially lead FI, so INFPs, tend to make really good like judges, lawyers, law professors, legal scholars, because again, even though we sort of think of it as sort of this TI domain, it really is more of an FI domain. It really is more of an ethical, you know, we've got two parties that, logically speaking, in a TI world, both should be winners, right? They should both be winning this case, but clearly they can't both win the case. So we're going to have to come up with some sort of FI solution, something on, what's fair. So INFPs, because of that extroverted intuition and that introverted feeling, functions, they're going to be very good at exploring and understanding the different approaches, right? What are the arguments in favor of the railroad company? What are the arguments in favor of the farmers? What are the arguments in favor of the prosecution? What are the arguments in favor of the defendant? And then, again, based off of culture, based off of other cases that have sort of developed through the common law system, just sort of our general approach of how we solve these sorts of cases, or the sort of the ethical framework that we rely on, they're going to come up with, what they think is the best FI solution. And of course, that's why you have legal scholars battling over, what the quote unquote right solution is. For years, because they're coming at it, from different FI principles or different FI frameworks. And then you get all the ENTPs and the INTPs swooping in, and they want to bring a TI solution to this FI question of, what's going to be, the best economic solution, what's going to end up costing society more in dollars and cents terms. We don't care so much about whether it's fair, but whether it's going to, hurt or harm the overall economy, or, consumer prices or whatever, right? Very TI kind of stuff. So that's why you see, various battles fought at different levels, because it is this sort of battle between the FI people sort of battling it out in their FI domain, and then the TI people sort of swooping in and getting involved and just saying, well, it doesn't really matter, who's correct on an FI level. Let's look at the TI stuff. How is this going to affect the economy? Blah, blah, blah. And so they would probably come in and say, well, it's going to cost the railroad company way more than it's going to cost the farmers to just, buy insurance or build a shed or build a fence or something to protect themselves. Why are we, like economically speaking, why are we making the trains pay for it, right? That's a very TI, ENTP, INTP kind of solution to it. Okay. And then I think, with ISFPs, and I might get into this a little bit more in a different video, because it's very salient to me when dealing with ISFPs or interacting with ISFPs, that they're not so much about exploring different solutions, but they're more locked into, like, they've got a code, and they're just like, this is fair or this is not fair, right? Everybody is supposed to act according to these rules, just this code. And if somebody is doing something outside of the code, then they're just wrong. And and again, because of that extroverted sensing, it's much more grounded. It's much more like, this is just the way it is, right? This is the code. And I think of like characters like Omar from The Wire, who just had, this code that, he would either, even though he was kind of a quote unquote bad guy or a villain or an outlaw, however you want to think of him, he lived by this code. And, and if you were cool with him and followed his code and didn't break any rules, no problem. But if you broke any of his rules, according to his code, then you had a serious problem. Um, so that's a very kind of ISFP kind of way. So they're not going to be as flexible as the INFPs. The INFPs are going to sort of search the problem space and try to, weigh all the equities, so to speak. But the ISFPs are probably going to be more like, there's a code. And I can imagine if any ISFP, was presented with the train Sparks cases, they probably have an automatic reaction of, who's at the wrong here. And my sense is that they probably see the trains as being in the wrong because they're the ones, causing the problem. But that, again, that might be a very US centric, or maybe a Western centric view of the way things should work. Because maybe people from other cultures or just people who don't really care that much about property rights as much, might just be like, well, it's just stupid. Why would the farmers you know keep their hay there? Why don't they just move it? If that's the problem, and why are they just making a big fuss out of something that they could fix themselves, right? They could build a shed or build a fence or move the hay out of the way. Why are they being so obstinate, right? So I could see an ISFP also reacting like that. But the point being that it's almost this, just again, this sort of code, like you're supposed to just protect your own shit, and if you're letting somebody hurt, harm your shit or destroy your shit, that's on you, buddy. That's not their fault. I can definitely see an ISFP reacting like that, but I could also see an ISFP saying, well, train that this is totally the train's fault. They shouldn't be putting that harm out into the world, and and ruining other people's shit, right? Um, Again, I can see. I'm thinking of my ISFP friends, and I could see them going either way, and it's just kind of funny in my head. But it really, again, it just depends on what side, what their personal code is of what's fair and what's not fair, and how that fact scenario falls into it with the trades. And so ISFPs, they're definitely the ones that are going, you're going to hear them say, you're going to hear it's not fair from an ISFP a lot, right? When they're complaining about work, or, or some sort of relationship problem or some sort of social or issue with their friends or their family or something, you're going to hear it's not fair. It's not fair, because to them it's sort of outside of their code. INFPs, you probably hear it as well, but definitely with the ISFPs, because they live their life according to a code, and they sort of expect everybody else to have sort of the same code, that they do. And there's probably 80% overlap with most people, at least in their immediate culture, but not all the time. And again, a lot of people see this FI stuff as being TI logic, right? That it's just, if this, then that, then the answer's simple, right? You're either following the rules of my code or you're not, right? And it might come across as being kind of quote unquote logical, but it really is sort of FI based, right? It's not necessarily true. It's just true under the terms or the rules of your code, right? If you put it into a computer, who knows? It might come up with a different answer. Okay. And then the other way that I also see it sort of come out is, when you're working with like ISTJs, ESTJs, again, and I'm going to do a different video on this, sort of them in the workplace kind of thing. But, they are very process oriented, and they definitely spend most of their mental energy focused on the process and getting it done, whatever they're doing, the task at hand is. But to the sense, to the extent they have to deliberate on anything, where there's what I like to call sort of a jump ball issue, where you have to sort of make a decision. Do you go with plan A or plan B? They will very much focus on what's fair, right? Like what's fair to the employees, what's fair to the other party and the deal, what's fair to them. And a lot of times, like they'll just decide, okay, we're doing this, and you'll be like, well, you could do this, you could do that, you do, because we turn on our TI a lot of times, and they give all the different sort of logical ways of doing it. But ultimately, I think a lot of times they'll just be like, well, I get it. I might have to spend more money, or I might have to fill out more paperwork, or whatever. It might take longer, but in the end, it's the fair solution, right? It's the fairest solution to this problem. Um, and again, you see it in a lot of heavy TE users, where ultimately they just decide, okay, here's what's fair. Especially the ESTJs, you see that a lot. They care a lot about what's fair, and it's not just like they want to be perceived as being fair people. I mean, there's part of that, I'm sure, but it really is like, okay, presented with you know three different options, all things being equal, let's go with the thing that's the most fair to all the parties. Um, and so, I don't think they get enough credit for that, or the ISTJs for that matter. Okay, so that's my little spiel on FI. Again, I would think of it as this fairness generator, this way to deliberate and figure out solutions to problems where TI just isn't going to do it right on its own. Now, the converse of that is probably true as well, and I'll say that for another time, where sometimes you might have these competing FI solutions, like to some legal problem, and then the TI people swoop in and come up with a TI solution to it, or just say, okay, we're going to go with this person's because it makes more TI sense, more economic sense, that kind of stuff. It's going to make more money or not cost us as much money. So, okay. So thanks for stopping by, and see you next time.